Hello and welcome to Podcast Essentials. This session's on the recording space. It's one of those things that gets new people really worked up and rather worried. But we're going to debunk a lot of the myths around it today. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Rich Bowden. Hello, Mr. B.
Hello, John. Hello,
Where I show what the recording space I'm using right now looked like before and after I prepared it for recording. There's a couple of things to bear in mind with recording spaces, and they all go back to what we're trying to do in the first place to get the sound to our listeners. We need to remove lots of background noise if there is any, and we need to stop our own voices from echoing around the room. And we also need to be able to address our mic correctly, but that's an episode coming up. I think, in fact, that's the next episode, alternatives and microphones. So we'll get to that on Tuesday. But for the recording space itself, we need to take a look around. We don't need Abbey Road. We don't need a radio station sort type of setup. Those things they're for different purposes. Podcasting's about just the voice mostly. Occasionally there'll be some music, but it's about getting the person's voice into the ear of the listener. Now, a radio station comes with all the accoutrements of audio engineers and executive producers, and they're normally set within cities, so they've got to be soundproof quite heavily. And of course, the quality of the microphones they use is probably excessive for what they need, but it becomes an ego thing to have the most expensive microphone and the fanciest pieces of equipment. As podcasters, we don't need to do that, I don't think. What's your feeling on that, Rich?
Again, John, you get back to the point. We need something that's listenable, unless we're doing something very special like a stereo recording and in the studio, or, if it's something to do with music. But we need something that's listenable that people will be able to hear, but it doesn't need to be, most of us, to be able to produce something that, as you say, is studio quality. I think it's unnecessary.
Yeah, it's a fair point, because after all, we publish in .mp3 format, where most of the information in the sound files are removed anyway, but the voice is there. So we need to craft our audio files so that our voice is the key, not the background noise or anything else. And the thing with music studios and radio studios that people may have seen on telly or in films is that there's lots of people involved, particularly with music. So you have a microphone on every instrument, sometimes more than one. I know people have different microphones on each drum in a drum kit sometimes. Whereas with podcasts, we've got one or two, sometimes up to 4 or 5 people, but mostly one or two. And it's easier just to set the space up so that each person's microphone works as well as it can. I'm using a Zoom H2N at the moment. And what are you using, young Rich?
For internal use, I use the Rode. I'll just see if I can hold it up. I actually recommend it. It's this one, Rode NT USB, and I've just turned it around, but it only works one way, John. So it doesn't pick up the background noise that you were talking about. So what I'm talking here, it'll pick up, but it won't pick behind.
Yep.
If people could understand what I'm saying. So if there's any background noise, it'll reduce it anyway.
Exactly, and that's what I'm doing with the Zoom. I'll just take the spoffle off, and you can see that it's got the side here, and I'm actually talking to the other side. And I've got it set up so that only the microphones on this side. Let me just replace that. On the side facing me are working. That doesn't mean you can't get background noise or reverb or bounce happening, because it will pick up sounds that come to it. So if you're in a large echoey room or a small echoey room even, like you hear sometimes it sounds like people are recording in a lavatory or a wardrobe or something, and there's bounce and echo and reverb. So what I've done here, and you can see the photos in the blog post, is that I've hung in front of me on a clothes horse a very heavy throw rug that's nice and rippled, so it's not a flat surface, so that as the sound leaves my voice, gets picked up by the mic and carries on, excuse me, it's absorbed by the throw rug, and behind that I've got the curtains, and the curtains act as another baffle. These particular curtains are particularly light, so that's why I've added the extra layer with the throw rug. That and the settings, the zoom's infinitely programmable to your choice of setup, and that's another session on its own that we'll get to later.
John, I'm just looking at Mr. John Moore. Sorry to interrupt you, but
Yep.
It was the first. Oh, I got it. Yeah, it's the first blog post, isn't it? Yep.
Yeah, the one at the top of the page there.
Yeah, I can see what you're referring to. Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, thank you. So if we just think about where we're surrounded by and what the sound is likely to do, and quite often you just need to test and then listen, particularly if you're going to be in the one spot all the time. When I first started podcasting, we had a walk-in wardrobe, and I used to set up in there because all the clothing and whatnot would absorb the sound and there wouldn't be any bounce back. Mm-hmm. That, and I combined that with a small shotgun mic, the Rode Video Mic Me, and there's a link in that blog post, and there will be one in the show notes for the podcast when it comes out after this. And it's a small shotgun mic that clips onto the iPhone or any other phone for that matter that's got the 3.5mm jack. There's an adapter for the newer iPhones, and it just points so directly at the voice, provided it's positioned correctly, that all you get is the voice. And it's a really handy thing. It comes with a huge windsock or spoffle thing, so that if you're outside, you're not going to get the effect of the wind blowing across it either. Mm-hmm. And it's a really handy, useful tool that I always carry with me in case I need to do a recording on the run or whatever, and if I've left this at home. So that's a useful tool. Even the microphones on the iPhones and the newer smartphones are of such a quality that if you hold them close enough, like say here, and talk directly into them, and provided your background is baffled or soft, you're still going to get a good quality audio file. I've used that sometimes when I've been out interviewing people, and someone I bumped into and I didn't have my gear with me. So I'll just grab the phone and hit record, and then I can use that file later. And if you're using it for an interview, you talk into it, and then you hand it to the person to talk back to you, and vice versa. I mean, it's not ideal because you've got one track with both voices. Mm-hmm. Makes it a little bit more difficult if people are talking over each other, but it's a solution. And I think as podcasters, we need to be, creative, definitely problem solvers.
Adaptive, yes.
That's the word, yeah. Adapt, improvise, overcome, as young Bear Grylls would say. And basically you can podcast anywhere. I've been in situations when I've been traveling where I'll use the Zoom and I'll climb in under the doona, as we call them in Australia, or duvets as they call them here, and use that as a sound baffle to absorb the reverb in rooms that just aren't set up for recording or would take a lot of work to get set up. Well, I was in a place where they had a 4-poster bed with just the posts and not the rails along the top, so I just hung the bedding off that and talked into it, and that worked just as well. So it's about adapting and using what you've got. If you can set up your own space and you've got room to do that, well, that's fine. But I wouldn't go over the top with sound baffles and whatnot. I'd just hang heavy curtains around the walls, because they seem to work really well. And yourself, Rich, you made any modifications?
We've just done a little bit of renovating, John, so I'm down in the back room. And what I did get was thick curtains. You might just be able to see the edge of them behind me. And they are backed curtains. So when I do get a bit of noise from the road, it does to a certain extent block that. The other thing I was going to mention, John, is that I think it's important to have a carpet wherever you record. It does absorb a lot of the sound, and if you have a carpeted room compared to one that's got floorboards, it will absorb it, as far as I can see anyway. The question I was going to ask you though, John, and for the listeners and viewers might have the same question: is how do you, when you record, do you face the window or do you face the wall? Which is better for you sound wise?
Okay, well, because I've got curtains on the windows and hard surfaces away from them, I've got the throw rug in front of me, just behind the table, then the curtains. I find talking into the curtains rather than into the room. But if you haven't got anything that can sound baffle, facing into an open room from the corner is a way around it. You're talking about the floor carpeting would be nice, but where I am, there isn't any. So we just make adjustments, keep the mic relatively close, and make sure that the background noise is absorbed. So as it goes, the sound travels from my voice through the Zoom past the laptop. Bits of it are bouncing off the table, but they're hitting into the throw rug that's really sort of ripply. And so that picks up that sort of sound and stops it bouncing back. And the fact that the microphone on this side's turned off means it's not going to be picked up there either. But it's possible to get fanatical about this, because I'm not sure if you heard it, but our fridge just turned on and it's behind me, so the microphone's pointing at it. I'm not sure if you picked that up as it came on or not. But
no, I didn't. I didn't, John. No.
It can become. You can go down lots of rabbit holes trying to track down sound that other people just aren't going to hear anyway. And then you can just adjust the bottom ends and whatnot in editing to take out those lower sounds anyway. But by having this set up with all those options anyway, and it might look just like a microphone, but it's actually quite a complicated little device. And so we can cut out we've got a low cut set on it, so that removes all the lower end noise to start with. And it's been set up for vocals, narration vocals rather than singing vocals. So there's lots of little things. And it took me about, 2 months of experimenting to get all the right settings on it, which involves, if you're going to do it, write down every change you make. Because that's the difference between science and just messing about. You need to record what you're doing on all kinds of levels. Unintended pun there.
Which Zoom is that, John?
This is the H2N. It's sort of the one that was standard for outdoor recording by journalists taking notes or grabbing audio bites. I know Zoom's got lots of others. You've got a later model, I believe, Rich.
I've got the H5, and I find that I use that for outdoors interviews, and I find that's really good. Took your advice, John. I checked it for the settings, and it's set now for vocals. So if I do an interview outside, usually I do a lot of interviews in coffee shops. I know you shouldn't. You're supposed to avoid coffee shops, but I just can't. I just find myself I can't do that. But I can adjust it to a certain extent where it will, as you said, take out a lot of the lower end, and that can be much of the sound that you don't want anyway. So it's quite versatile in that respect. But I do prefer this little Rode mic for in the office at home. And as I think I've mentioned to you before, John, the Rode's a little bit complicated to set up, and it hasn't got a power source of its own, so you have to plug it into a computer. So that's another reason why I don't take it to interviews. I just leave it here.
Yeah, and the thing to remember is, if we're doing outdoor interviews in coffee shops or whatever, as long as we tell our listeners that there's some audio coming up that might have a bit of background noise, most people are happy to listen to it, because they know we're not going to give them content that's rubbish. And we wouldn't have put it on with the background noise if the person we're talking to didn't have some value for our listeners. And the thing, the mind tends to filter out those background noises anyway once we've listened for, 15, 20 seconds. It's, when I first moved, when I first moved to Sydney, we lived across the road from a train station. And for the first week, I couldn't sleep. But after that, I never heard another train. And it's that sort of thing, but on a smaller scale with a podcast, where people will filter out the background noise, even if they don't know they're doing it. So provided the information's good. I mean, I've had one interview where I just had to had to scrap it because the background noise was just so horrendous. And it's a shame because it was a really good interview with someone who knew what they were talking about. And we've rescheduled that for some time, but we keep missing diaries together. So, but that'll come together.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you've just got to bite the bullet and scrap the audio because it isn't good enough. If you're like this sort of thing with Hangouts on Air or whatever Google's calling it now, I had an interview with a fella in Nigeria, and the bandwidth at his end and my end started to go out of sync and get all chewed up, and it was just horrific. There was too many those shortwave radio noises in the back to be able to use or even clean up coming over the top of both of us. So you do what you can with what you've got, but setting up and we normally, if you can, find a place to use the same place every time. That way you can set your settings for that environment. And if you've got the same settings in the same place, you're going to get a consistency of quality. Now, it's not always possible. And like I'm at a kitchen table here, so it's set up, take down, set up, take down.
Mm-hmm.
But I've got it down to a routine now where I know the settings. They don't change on this. I set up the baffles behind me with the throw rugs, speak correctly into the microphone, and so we get the consistency. So if you're going to begin podcasting, and if you'd like to begin podcasting, there's some checklists available over at mrjohnmoore.com where I'd love to get you started. But if you're going to, think about where you'll be recording. There's a lot to go through before you start, but that's probably one of the last things that occurred to me when I was first starting. I was so concerned about getting the tech right and having the right microphone and all that sort of thing. But it's important to have the right space, or a space that's right enough. It's the creativity and the content that matters with podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the better the quality of the audio, the easier it is for people to listen. But we're not going to get the crystal clear Abbey Road feel, because it doesn't matter anyway by the time it's scrunched down to MP3. Now, I've heard of other people using, like you've got the Rode there. I heard of people using sort of $30 mics from eBay. And there was one of my students at the very first course I did had one, and he just set it up on a little tripod stand and did all the baffling. And it was a really cheap mic, but the sound was just brilliant because he knew how to use the tool. And as a young fella was telling to me yesterday, it's not the Hurley, it's the player. So know your equipment, work with your equipment, and then adapt yourself so that you get the very best out of it. And it's not actually that difficult, despite everything that we've been told about the wonders of audio and the setups we've seen on radio stations and whatnot. Now, I particularly like this setup here because it's above me and it's on an old laboratory stand, which of course everyone's got lying around their house from their days of making meth. But by having it up there, it means I'm not going to bump it with my elbow. It's sitting on a really heavy base so that it's not going to be, it won't bump, it won't travel if I bump the table. So I'll give you, for instance, so I don't know if you're picking up any of that sound, Rich.
Yeah, just a bit, yep.
Yeah, but it's not a lot. And as a general rule, during a recording session, I don't spend a lot of time bumping the table. So they're the tools I have. I've found a way to make them work in the space I've got, and it's adaptable to other spaces when I move. So these are the sorts of things you need to think about, I think. You got any thoughts on that, Rich?
Just to confirm what you just said, John, about it doesn't really matter about the microphone. You can go through as many blog posts as you like and read experts' opinion on the latest microphone and spend an awful lot of money. But as you pointed out, you just get someone that knows what they're doing, and a relatively cheap mic can work. I think there was, I'm not sure if you read it as well, John, I think I pointed out to you about this particular sound engineer who put a post up in between a lot of these, what's the latest mic posts on one of the podcasters groups on Facebook. And he said, look, I tell everybody, as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you set up, you just need something that's relatively good, and that'll get the job done for you. It's just he said, I think his words were something like, having control over the environment is much more important than the microphone itself. It's good to have a nice microphone, but it's the environment and knowing how to, as you say, John, baffle the sound, make it sound good, and be aware that you don't need perfect sound. I think that's pretty much sums up what you were saying.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Well, pretty much what I was trying to say, but put with much better words. There was something that occurred to me while you were saying that, and it's gone now. Oh, yes. The more expensive the microphone, so say up to, say, $100, like this I got for $150 second hand. I think they're about $300 new. But once you get above sort of $500 or $600 for a microphone, each extra $100 improves the sound quality by less, if you know what I mean. So you get a diminishing return on investment. So if you've got a $10,000 mic, you probably need a $100,000 studio to get the best out of it.
Yeah,
and most of us podcasting aren't going to be in that sort of position.
Mm-hmm.
And with the modern algorithms, and post-production techniques and whatnot that we've got, it's much easier to tidy up audio files than it used to be. And we're not going out live most of the time, apart from these things, obviously. But most podcasters don't go live. But that's whereas most radio shows are live. The music ones and the FM and whatnot. I know Radio 4 and the BBC and the ABC at home on Radio National and things. They're more recorded audio programs, but it's the same thing. You don't need to have the $10,000 mic unless you particularly have more money than time, I guess. And the handling that's required with those hypersensitive directional mics is just unbelievable. So I find one that'll get the job done is the go. Don't fret too much about it when you're beginning. Just grab something and learn it. And if you feel you need to improve it because there's something wrong with it, or you'd prefer to go from a USB connection, because sometimes you can get a ping in the USB as the computer gets older, or you haven't updated the firmware on the Zoom. Well, I've had a horrific interview where I had to re-record my side of it because of that. But that happens. And you might want to go to an XLR. But I find the digital audio recorders are good because you've got a separate file so that if the computer crashes, you've still got a copy of it here. Or if your editing suite goes down in the middle of something, you can go back and start again. And the idea of having a backup file separate on a separate device really appeals to me. It's sort of belts and braces.
And John, I know you're going to get into microphones in a little bit more detail in the next webinar, but it really is about getting a microphone that suits you too, isn't it? And the purposes that you want. There are so many microphones out there, and they all have different personalities, and they have different gains. Some have automatic gains. So I'm pretty sure you're going to get into that next webinar, I think. Is that right?
Next Tuesday, yeah.
Tuesday, yeah.
And if you really want to go down that rabbit hole, there's a fella called Mike who does a podcast called Mike on Mics. And that's all he does. And it's way beyond my need for knowing or levels of understanding. But so just to reiterate, there's a blog post covering this on mrjohnmoore.com. Just go to type that in and go to the tab that says blog, and that'll pull the top one up for you. Think about the space you're recording in. Put as much baffling in as you can. You don't have to buy soundboards. You can if you want, but throw rugs, heavy curtains, especially the ones that have got backing on them to keep the heat in or out, and thoughtful positioning of the mic relative to the mouth, and thoughtful positioning of where you're sitting and facing relative to the stuff in the room you're in. And really, the only way to learn is by doing. And by doing, I mean doing and publishing. Because if you're not publishing it, you're not learning really. It adds that frisson of fear that keeps us going and adds another layer. Remember the first one of these I did, I was more worried about the tech happening than whether or not anything else was working. It's the same with the first sort of 5 or 10 podcasts I did. Okay, so there'll be an event listed on Podcast Like a Pro page on Facebook, telling people when this is on in their part of the world. Next Tuesday morning here in Ireland, Tuesday evening there in sunny Australia. And I think with that, we might pull this one to an end. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you again, John. Thanks, listeners. Thanks, viewers.
Bye.